Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello and welcome to Gender and Society. This is lecture number 19, where we are going to be talking about gender research globally. Now, as you have seen over the course of the the series of lectures on gender and society, that we have talked about, we have started with talking about some of the theoretical premises that have informed gender relations or the idea of gender evolution through societies, and then we have looked at some of the major institutions, such as family, marriage, education, health, in which gender plays an important a role. And then we have looked at certain methodological interventions of how to make meaning of the nature of data that is presented to us as researchers on gender, and depending on the nature of the data, whether it is better or more effective to do a qualitative study or do a quantitative study or adopt a mixed method approach. So we have seen over the past couple of weeks, where we have talked about the methodological intervention. And in this lecture, we are going to look at some of the major theoretical patterns and trends that went on with the gender research across the world over time. So I'm not going to talk about any specific area or geographically or any specific research in this context. What I will be doing is walk you through some of the earlier works that have been done in the context of gender research, and then some of the conceptual journey that gender has made in this regard, and some of the questions with regard to evolving nature, evolving trends in gender studies, and is there a shift in focus. So that is pretty much what we are going to be talking about, the larger questions of patterns, the larger questions of trends that we see about gender research globally. One of the earliest studies in gender was forwarded by Ruth Benedict, who was an American anthropologist, and this comes with a belief from a belief system that culture was the product of human choices rather than cultural determinism. So the fact that culture is socially produced, culture is a product of human choices, so it comes from that belief system. Although this study does not explicitly focus on gender, but it does talk about gender as an important cultural component, which shows or which exposes the various ways in which stereotypes are made in society. Stereotypes are born in society, and she wanted to show through her work that how these stereotypes can be undone, how they can be broken down. So her field work was among the American Indians, contemporary European and Asian societies. And one of her very significant works was the Chrysanthemum and the Sword, where she looked at the patterns of the Japanese culture, where she made an attempt to understand the people of America was at war with during the Second World War. So in a way, she was trying to understand the role of culture in building a human personality, and this was one of the earliest works on culture, which alludes to factors of gender that we see in this regard. The second early works, very significant in this respect, and this directly brings in gender in the conversation, was by another American anthropologist called Margaret Mead, where she looked at the relationship among the configuration of culture, socialization in each particular culture, and individual personality formation. So, like Ruth Benedict, Margaret Mead was also interested in understanding how individual personalities develop and the role of culture in the development of such personalities. So, she explored the human development in a cross-cultural perspective, and she covered topics on gender roles and child rearing in American and foreign cultures, and she was directly focusing on how the various gender roles shift with regard to one society to the next, and the norms, the values that are constructed around the concepts of child rearing, child caring in other cultures as compared to American cultures. Her one of her most significant works, titled Coming of Age in Samoa, described how individual development was determined by cultural expectations and was not biologically determined. So, you see that this brings into the conversation again that from a very early time on, some of these scholars, some of these theorists were already trying to unpack gender from a sole understanding of the biological essentialism. And again, they explored how individual personality developed in response to culture. But then for Margaret Mead, gender was understanding gender roles, understanding roles around childbearing, mothering, child caring, was at the center of the discussion. And you can see here where Samoa is in the Pacific Ocean, and in the picture you can see that she is actually interacting, so doing ethnography, interacting with the people in Samoa. So this brings us to a constant debate, a constant dialogue that we have been having throughout this course between biology and gender. And we have seen that the differences in terms of the biological sex roles exist universally, and we have evidence, we have studies such as the August 2006 study on it was done in 27 countries, found that women did most of the housework, and with parenthood the gender roles were also very split. So fathers concerned with finances, expressive issues, childcare in all countries, while mothers concerned with childcare only in less affluent countries. So the idea of childcare was now evolving, to transcend the biological understandanding. And in this two graphs that you can see, this is we have seen this two bar charts in when we talked about gender and globalization. So we see that because the differentiation between males and females in terms of gender role ideologies, gender stereotypes exist. Therefore, we see such a disparity time that women spend on unpaid work or the informal labor than men, as you see in the first graph, and then how women do less paid work than men in the second graph. So this falls in sync with much of the studies that have been carried on with respect to understanding biology and gender across cultures. So we have other studies such as by Williams and Best in 1982, who have studied 30 countries and where they have a high pan-cultural agreement on the adjectives used to describe males and females. So in all the countries that they have studied, they have seen that the adjectives associated with men are usually stronger and more active, and they have seen that participants from countries such as Japan and South Africa rated male characteristics as more favorable, and while in Italy and Peru they rated female characteristics more favorable. So there have been an understanding that there are these adjectives that we use to signify male and female, signify masculine, signify feminine, and there are these variations across the countries, across cultures, where in some countries the male characteristics are rated with higher value, while in some countries the female characteristics are rated with higher value. So then the question is that how congruent are behaviors with stereotypes, and does this congruence differ across cultures? So how much in sync is an individual's personality, individual's behavior in sync with the stereotypes? So all cultures have some sort of a stereotype or a bunch of stereotypes. And the question here is that are these stereotypes related to important psychological constructs of or behavior? So how do one construct a stereotype? And to remind you, one of the definitions we started this course with in the first lecture, that stereotyping refers to the process by which one-sided or exaggerated and usually prejudiced views of groups or categories of people are developed and maintained. So that is a way that stereotypes function in society. So now that we know that how gender affects cultural personality, gender influences behaviors. So are these stereotypes, these gender stereotypes, related to the psychological constructs or behaviors? So that is something that scholars are still looking at, and there is no definite or no single answer to that yet. So this also brings us to a concept that you were introduced and now you have to put into application, is the idea of sociological imagination. So how do we look at social reality and understand social problems? And this is an idea, the sociological imagination, that was put forward by Mills, where you have the social institutions, the social structures, and the social patterns, influencing a person's or a group's, sociological imagination. So it has been used in a lot of theoretical frameworks, and it has been used in several of the sociological concerns of description and analysis. So now if you revisit the idea of Mills in terms of sociological imagination, you can see that how a person's or a group's sociological imagination can influence gender norms at the social at the level of social institutions, at the level of social patterns, at the level of social structures. So to remind you the definition, the sociological imagination is the ability to see the relationship between individual experiences and the larger society. So and this in a way tells us why do we have certain gender roles that we have in society and not some other roles. So, on that note, to understand gender role socialization, we let's look at some of the theories from psychoanalytics, and we start with Freud's psychoanalytic theory, where the key is the process of identification, the process by which a person internalizes a set of behaviors, attitudes and characteristics exhibited by someone very close to the individual. The children unconsciously model the behavior of their parents. So, if you follow a child very carefully, you will see that that child grows up into internalizing certain behavior, certain attitudes, certain characteristics by imitating either one of the parents or somebody the child is close to. So, this learning process, this process of identification by the process of internalizing by following or modeling another behavior is explained by Freud's psychoanalytic theory. The object relations theory in this regard tells us that humans are fundamentally relationship seeking. We form relationships with people and with things. So, one of the premises on which human civilization is built on is the concept of connectedness. So, this follows from there that humans are social beings and they organize themselves into groups all the time, and there are norms, there are objectives, there are missions with which groups are formed. So, this boundary work of forming a group, of forming relationships can be explained through the object relations theory. The next set of theories that we look at in terms of gender role socialization is the social learning theory, that we imitate people through observational learning. And we have talked about the idea of social learning before, where we have talked about cognitive factors, behavioral factors and situational factors. They all influence a person's social learning process. The cognitive development theory tells us that children are motivated to model the behavior of members of their gender. The child is an active participant in his own development, and gender becomes an organizing scheme for the developing child. So, again going back to the Freudian psychoanalytic theory, that if you closely follow children, they are likely to model the behavior of the members of their own gender. So, girls tend to imitate their mothers or their aunts, and boys tend to imitate their fathers or uncles. So, you see that this is an active participant in the learning process and internalizing that learning. The third theoretical lens in this regard that is helpful is the symbolic interactionism, where people act towards things based on the meanings those things have for them, and gender is created through social interaction. That is, doing gender refers to seeing gender as an activity accomplished through routine social interaction. So, again, symbolic interactionism brings with it the idea that gender is a fluid social concept, a fluid social construction, and doing gender, the very idea that we say doing gender refers to an activity accomplishment through social interaction, and doing gender keeps on being a work in progress. So, of the continuums that we have seen in the past, so these two continuums form an important dimension in this discussion of gender role socialization, where we talk about gender identity or the psychological sense of the self, where we have man on one hand, woman on the other end, and the third gender in the middle. and then the gender expression continuum, where we have masculine and feminine on the two ends and the androgynous in the middle. So, as you can see that much of the ways in which people are socialized in society, either as a child or as an adult, goes a long way to inform where on either of these two continuums would one place himself or herself. So, whether you would like to place yourself towards the left of the continuum or towards the right of the continuum depends on how much, or what has been the form of your gender role socialization in that society. So, having understood some of the theoretical premises from which the understanding of gender comes from, and from a debate between biology and gender, and then using some of the psychological parameters and sociological lenses, let's now look at some of the evolving nature of gender in sociology scholarship over time. So, currently we see that major trends in the study of sociology of gender includes education and the health sectors, in violence prevention, and in anti-discrimination and equal opportunity policy. So, these have been some of the key areas in which some of the significant works of gender scholarship using the sociological lens has premised on. However, if you look at the history, and if you look at the changing place of gender in sociology, you will come across a range of or a trend of evolution of the focus of study in gender, starting with the idea of the missing feminist revolution in sociology, identified by Stacey and Thorne in 1985. So, this is the one of the earliest debates, 19th century debates in sociology, where it was preoccupied with European understandings of modernity and its experience of industrialization, class conflict, alienation, bureaucracy. So, just to recap, we have talked about how the idea of modernity, modernism, postmodernism as paradigms have shifted, and there are multiple ways we can assume or we can define modernity. So, this idea of modernity, which was primarily European, was experienced through industrialization, class conflict, alienation, bureaucracy. And in that discussion, there was very little or no space for talking about gender. So much of the scholarship that you see around that time, produced around that time, you do not see a focus on, a definite focus on talking about gender. And we see that, the 19th century sociology in the global metropole, however, drew much of its data from the colonized world, and it is here in this data set that is drawn from the colonized world that we find indication of gender and race. So, the context now shifts from the idea of European modernity in the West to the idea of the colonized world in the 19th century. And we see that the data, the evidence gathered around that time did talk about the intersections of gender and race, which goes beyond, the then, dominating paradigms of the Marx, Weber, Durkheim debate, which, have been the classic sociological debates in the field. So, there were, so it's not that gender was completely missing from the discussion. Gender was there in this particular context when we are talking about the colonized world. And it was, seen particularly with the status of women that was commonly seen as an index of progress. So, as we have seen in several of the historical references that we have seen throughout this course, that understanding the status of women in society is seen as whether the society is progressive or not. So, it is the index of progress in society, and this is one of the earliest ways of understanding how gender operates in society. The partial retreat in the 20th century from imperial concerns and a sharp retreat from the Comtean, the August Comtean framework, to focus on social difference and social conflict within the society of the metropole signified how we understand the next transition. So, again, to remind you, the Comtean framework, Auguste Comte's framework of positivism, and there was a partial retreat from the imperial concerns and a very sharp retreat from the Comtean understanding, and the focus now started to be on the social differences, the social conflict within the society of the metropole. So, that was a next shift that we see from the 19th century to the 20th century research on gender across the world. Now, from the mid 20th century, we see that gender issues started to be mainly understood as questions about the domestic order inside the metropolitan society. So, now more and more questions about the biological sex roles, questions about the biological essentialism are coming to the fore, and the way that gender issues were mainly understood were in the inside the metropolitan society's domestic order, how households function, how families function, what were the various gender roles that were carried out inside the home and family. So, this was the era of the biological sex role concepts as is understood in the Western context by the Talcott Parsons context of the biological sex roles driving the nature of division of labor within families. We also see that there was a change in gender norms that was recognized, but their conceptualization of sex roles was addressed by the functioning and normative integration of the northern society understood as a closed system. So, much of these roles, much of these biological roles were becoming normative and becoming integrated into much of the Western society, which was also understood as a closed system. And after that, around the 1970s, we see the first phase of feminist sociology, which offered a more critical evaluation of norms and roles, and was now seen as restrictions on women's freedom without immediately changing the conceptual framework. So, the framework did not change overnight. The framework remained, but it was until the 1970s or around the 1970s that we see that for the first time, or the first phase of feminist sociologists started questioning much of the restrictions on particularly women's freedom in society. And from that time onward, the growth of gender as a central concept in sociological discipline grew, and currently is one of the largest fields in empirical sociology. So, the conversations that started in the 19th century with indirectly from Marx, Weber, Durkheim through Ruth Benedict, Margaret Mead, and then the first phase of feminist sociology. On that time onwards, and until now, as we see gender today, it has become now one of the largest, very significant fields of empirical sociology. We see that since that time, there has been shifts in focus on what scholars wanted to study, and studies of sexuality have become more prominent, which was influenced by the urgency of the struggle with the HIV/AIDS factors. So, we see that there was a transition from understanding just the rigid biological roles to understanding a little more fluid gender roles, to understanding more fluid ideas of sexuality. The scale of gender based violence across the world kept on rising, unfortunately, and although there is no adequate theorization done on gender based violence yet, however, this is one of the most central areas of gender scholarship. That work is being carried on, and just to attend to the unfortunate rise, understanding the unfortunate rise of gender based violence across the world. We have seen that there has been an increasing focus in understanding gender patterns in schooling. So the sociology of education has come up in its own dimension, where we talk about the various patterns, the trends in terms of gender in education, and we have looked at some of these trends when we were talking about gender and education. And then we see that under the influence of the post-structural thought since the 1980s, that is 10 years after the first feminist sociology movement started, the discursive construction of gender identity and the instability of gender identity became major themes. So now, with the idea of post-structuralism kicking in, the fluidity or the instability of gender identity started to attract focus, and in this context, the questions of embodiment, the question of understanding the nature of the human body was set in the forefront of the debates. So, just to remind you some of the key characteristics of what post-structuralism brought with it. Post-structuralism sees reality as being much more fragmented, diverse, tenuous and culture specific than structuralism. So, it was a paradigm shift that happened from structuralism to understanding reality to being more fragmented, yet interconnected and fluid. And post-structuralism's greater attention to specific stories, to the details and local contextualizations of concrete instances vis-a-vis or in comparison to the meta-narratives. So, in post-structuralism, we do not see a single a monolithic idea. We do not see a meta-narrative or a set of meta-narratives, but we do see that the details of local contextualizations with concrete evidence. There has been a greater emphasis on understanding the body, the human body, and the actual adding of the human into the texture of time and history. So, we see the introduction of the human, understanding the human in the context of time and history is what post-structuralism brings with it. There has been a greater attention to specifics of cultural working, to the arenas of discourse and cultural practice. As we have seen couple of lectures back, when we talked about gender in culture and media, we talked about Stuart Hall's idea of discourse production and discursive ways in which gender is produced and reproduced through culture and media. So, we see that this is also a key characteristic feature of post-structuralism. And of course, as we have seen that greater attention to the role of language and textuality in the construction of reality and identity. So, the role that language played, the role that texts play in the construction of reality is something again that we have seen in the past a couple of lectures back. So, as you know that the transition from the understanding of the human body as nature to the body as socially constructed and the idea of embodiment, this is the journey that encapsulates the idea of post-structuralism, and this is this is the point in which we are talking about post-structuralism actually happened. So, through this through the idea of the body as socially constructed to the larger question of embodiment. Now, that was what gender used to be looked at in terms of conceptualization in the West in that the 19th 20th mid 20th century, and then we see the first wave of feminism, and then post-structuralism. So there was a paradigm shift. Now there's another set of literature, another set of sociological scholarship that looks at gender and the relationship of gender as a concept with colonialism. And in this regard, several scholars have talked about gender as a product of colonialism that was imposed on societies which previously did not organize themselves in gendered ways. And one of the very significant works in this respect is Oibumi's The Invention of Women. So these scholars argue that before the advent of colonialism in the colonized countries, in the colonized regions of the world, gender was actually not an important or integral part of social organization. So there may have been other ways of social organization, such as seniority. So so societies were organized based on whether a member of the society is senior or not. So seniority used to be one of the important organizing principles in many of the societies before colonialism. And so some scholars think that gender has been an introduction after colonialism to these areas. However, there are other scholars who argue that such as Uma Narayan, that virtually every community is structured by relationships of gender that comprise specific forms of social, sexual and economic subjection of women. So these sets of scholars, they argue that if you have a society that is comprised on any form of social, biological and economic subjection of women, then the gender order is definitely present as a social organizing principle. So, and it is hard to talk about a society that did not have historically these forms of subjection. So this is kind of another set of argument that is put forward, that it has probably been there as an organizing principle in societies such as these. So this view is also complicated by some research that shows that pre-colonial conceptions of gender were complex and structured differently from European conceptions. So this idea, although is valid, is made complex by an idea that the pre-colonial idea of gender was different from how the European conceptions of gender operated, based on the prehistoric understanding. So this is an understanding that comes from the body of literature that talks about the relationship between gender and colonialism. Now we have another body of literature set in the context of gender and colonialism, and that talks about masculinity. We have seen a couple of significant works in the past, particularly Mrinalini Sinha's work of the colonial masculinity, and here we have Ashish Nundi's work of the intimate enemy, the loss and recovery of self under colonialism, which shows again that the idea of masculinity is socially constructed. So, in this work we see that Nandi traces how the pressure of the British conquest and the colonial regime reshaped the cultural understanding of the gender order, and there was justification for new patterns of masculinity in a modernizing process. So, again, just like the work by Sinha, we see in Nandi's work, masculinity was a social construction during the colonial rule, and we see that the colonial encounter reshaped models of masculinity even for the colonizers. So, the ideas of masculinity were getting redefined not just between the colonizers and the colonized, but also amongst the colonizers and amongst the colonized. So, that is one area where historically speaking much of the relationship between gender and colonialism has been explored. And we see that the emphasis on research with regard to masculinity has continued, and more recently we see that masculinities and the negotiation of gender relations in colonial and particularly post-colonial transitions have been talked about a lot in research that focused on Southern Africa. And these research they point out not just on the sheer diversity of masculinity, the various types of masculinity that are created, that are recreated, of the constant dialogues between the traditional and the modern manhood, but also how intimately the making of masculinity, the idea or the evolution of masculinity involves transformation of post-colonial societies. So, the emphasis on masculinity that started as a historical project has continued over time, and these are some of the recent trends that we see in several parts of the world that the focus on masculinity is on. So, if we have to look at gender, shifting an emphasis from the the northern understanding, from the global northern understanding to an understanding of the global south, or to an understanding in much of the colonized parts of the world, it therefore brings with it question of diversity and question of multiplicity of gender forms. So, we see that not just there's a question with diversity in gender forms, but also the sheer number, the multiplicity of gender forms, not at the level of the individual, but at the level of gender order and the dynamic of gender relations on a societal scale. So, not just are we talking about multiple ways or multiple types of gender forms here, but we are also talking about a change of scale. We are talking about shifting from the individual to understanding a gender order that is at a societal scale. So, that is one trend that we see happening across gender scholarship in sociological understanding across the world. So, just to give you an idea that what type of scholarship are getting produced in some of the major areas of the world, in Africa, Asia, Latin America and Europe, and I'll walk you through some of the major focuses. For example, in Africa, we see much of the current gender scholarship has been invested in three areas, starting with understanding the politics, state and empowerment of women, and these all tie back to the discussion on international relations, gender and international relations, gender and globalization, and the empowerment of women. The next area that the scholarship on looking at Africa focuses on is on work, education and globalization. So the idea that gender is intimately related with work and employment and education is where research is being focused on. And the idea of sexuality, health and gender-based violence, as I said, that the unfortunate rise of gender-based violence over the past years have called in for added attention to understanding the issues, and much of the scholarship in this respect is invested in understanding the sexuality, health and issues of gender-based violence. In Asia, we see that most of these scholarship are invested in understanding the militarization and the world gender order, particularly in Central Asia, in East Asia, in South Asia. Invested on understanding the ideas of human trafficking. So the ideas of gender-based human trafficking, and we have seen such movements. We have seen when we were doing gender movements, we talked about the half the sky movement, and movements such as that are also invested in understanding these social issues. Scholarship in the Asian context are also focusing on understanding the patriarchal family systems and how those family systems are evolving with time. So what are the new understandings of family system, what are the new patterns of family systems that are arising, that are coming out in current trends. So much of scholarship is invested in that. Making gender equality a fundamental aspect of development programs, that we have seen that in Asia there is a constant and a serious effort of making gender equality a fundamental aspect. And we have talked about several of the legislations, several of the issues around fundamental rights, particularly in the Indian context, where there has been a lot of attention towards achieving gender equality, and this and it has found expression in the form of many of the development programs. And finally, in the Asian context, we see the transnational systems linking local and the diaspora. So, again, historically, Asia has been, geographically speaking, a land of, a land which, sent out people, people emigrated from Asia to the West, and that has produced over the decades, over time, transnational systems between the migrants, and more we see that these transnational systems are now shifting base within Asia. So there's a lot of research that is invested in understanding mobility within Asia. So how does the diaspora connect with the local? How does the diaspora connect with the homeland, or how does migrants connect with home? So the migration literature, the transnational migration literature, is also where much of the research focusing on Asia looks at. In the context of Latin America and the Caribbean, we see that research has been focusing on resisting neoliberal and neo-structural globalization policies. So, it is a at the structural level negotiation, and a defending of reproductive health and rights. So, again new concepts of health and rights in terms of reproductive health. So, these are the two important areas where much of this gender based scholarship in Latin America and Caribbean has been invested in. And in Europe, we see that scholarship focused on the major economic and political shifts since the 20th century as it affected gender, particularly with regard to labor policies, child care and fertility. And of course, with the current trends of immigration and newer understanding of creation of the post-colonial subject, that is where much of this scholarship, gender-based scholarship focusing on Europe, looks at. So, some of the ongoing trends look at gender across societies as a multi-level system of social practices. So, as I give you some of these examples, that not just restricted to understanding of the individual, the understanding of the self, but how can we understand gender as a social structure, as a social process, as a part of a multi-level system of social practices. And it does look at very, very heavily what produces distinctions between women and men, and what organizes inequality on the basis of those distinctions. So, the premise of understanding gender inequality, that why certain categories of people are less privileged in society than the other, and much of this privilege and less privilege dialogue rests on a gender conversation, to focusing on understanding gender inequality. And then we see that there are shifting trends of focusing on the global south, emerging trends of Pan-Asian gender and mobility, as I talked about, that the focus of studying mobility, whether it's migration or any other sort of mobility, is shifting from the West to understanding mobility, say within Asia or in the global south. And understanding what are some of these trends, some of these new trends that are coming out of the gender research. And in that respect, we did talk about the background to the decade of UN Women, where these three movements have been at the backdrop: the women's rights movement, the human rights movement, and movements against colonialism has been at the backdrop of channelizing many of the shifts in understanding, the current shifts or trends in current gender research. So, in the close of this lecture, I do want to emphasize that much of the current research that is invested in gender studies, the sociological study of gender, is invested on understanding gender inequality. And to quote sociologist Michael Kimmel, the future of gender differences is intimately tied to the future of gender inequality. So, whatever will be the future of gender inequality will determine the future of gender differences. And on the map you can see the current prevalence of gender inequality across the world. The lighter parts of the map shows that gender inequality is less than 171, and then the figures rise up, and the darkest parts shows that gender inequality is really a social issue in those areas. So with that, I want to leave you with a question to reflect on, that given the various trajectories that gender research has traveled over time and space, is it possible to attain a degendered society, and why? So can we think of a society where gender doesn't matter or gender is not functional, and with regard to the journey, the trajectories that gender research has traveled, is it possible to think of a society, and why? So the moment you can answer that why, a lot of your questions will be clear, that can we think of a society that gender doesn't matter, or can we give an example of a society or a social practice or a social arrangement or a social organization, the way a society is organized, where gender doesn't matter, and why? If you are interested for further reading, you can look up this article by Connell, The Sociology of Gender in Southern Perspective, where Connell talks about the various shifting trends in gender studies across the world. So in the next lecture, which is going to be the concluding lecture for this course, I will take up a few more of the future directions in gender studies. Thank you.